We've all heard that to learn a language, you need to study hard and you need to be consistent. But what does that actually mean? There are people that study for years and years and yet they find themselves struggling to communicate in the language. In this video, let me share a mindset with you that helps me absorb languages like a sponge, whether that is in a classroom or in self-directed learning. Imagine this. You're going through the beginning chapters of your textbook, and you look at the grammar section and at the vocabulary you have to learn. Then you start reading the chapter's text. You're recognizing just enough words to get the main idea of the text. After you're done reading, you answer the questions and move on to the next task. Maybe another reading comprehension task, or a picture description task, or writing a short essay about what you do on the weekends. You keep repeating this process over and over until you're eventually at a point where you can read simple books, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, The Magic Tree House. At this point, you're still only at a point where you can grasp the core meaning of the sentence. There are many unknown words and unknown grammar structures, but you can still kinda get it. You're really proud of yourself for having gotten to this point, and you really want to finally start reading your first book in a foreign language. And I would agree, you've done great up until this point. But I think how you approach this next step or this next stage of your learning will make a huge difference in how successful you'll be. Up until this point, you've been trying to learn how to swim. Constantly just trying to keep your head above the water, being bombarded with new words and new grammar structures and a completely new pronunciation from every side. In the beginning, it's just about survival. It's about getting to a point where not everything feels strange and overwhelming anymore. That's why in the beginning, we tend to focus on the most important parts of a sentence, and everything else just goes completely over our head. Unfortunately, I think that this can lead to some unbeneficial habits that make it harder to learn later down the line. When you're focused on only the core meaning of a sentence, you become oblivious to everything else in it. Very basic things such as what other words were even in the sentence, to things like what conjugations or declensions were the verbs or noun in. And in more advanced speakers, that can be things like missing the nuance of a sentence or missing the word choice that a speaker has made or a grammatical construction that carries a certain tone with it. To reach higher levels of proficiency in a language, though, you need to at some point become aware of these things. I'm not telling you to go out into the wild right on your first day and to try to take notes of literally every tiniest little thing ever, because chances are you probably won't even be able to do that right from the beginning because your brain naturally filters out things like that. I think that it's perfectly fine to only focus on the essentials of a language in the beginning, things such as the most common words, basic sentence structure, and pronunciation. But as you progress, I ask you to not become complacent. Don't be satisfied when reading a sentence with only understanding who the agent was and what the action did. Be inquisitive, be curious, and more importantly, stay inquisitive and stay curious. I think something that everyone with any amount of impressive language ability does is to form hypotheses and ask questions accordingly. Now, this requires at least some amount of attention to detail, so if you're only kind of listening to whatever you're listening to, then this might be hard to do. And then all you do is that you take a mental note or a physical note of new things that you notice. This can be, for example, new words, or how a certain word is pronounced in a certain context, or that a certain word is even used in a certain context. It can be verb endings that you've never seen before, or that you have seen before, but just not in this case. Or it can be how compound words are formed, and so on and so forth. And then you ask yourself, is this how I learned this rule, or is this an exception? Is this verb irregular? If I use this verb to talk about myself, what would be the conjugation for this? Did the stem change, or is this a different word altogether? If you want to see a really good demonstration of this process in action, I recommend you check out the video up there and also a link down in the description made by Israel from Rhapsody in Lingo. Make sure to turn on the subtitles because that is where you will see what is kind of going on in his head. He's asking the right questions and he's making hypotheses about what he's hearing and seeing on screen. I think that this is so fascinating and it is a really good habit to get into. Once you get into the habit of doing this, you will notice how much more engaged you are in the learning process, especially beyond just putting in the time and hoping that your brain does the magic. Learning no longer is something that happens to you, but it is something that you can actively participate in, something that you can influence, and to me that's a really comforting thought. There is one more step that you can take to elevate your language learning experience and make it a bit more interactive too, which I would call something like hypothesis testing. This is especially good if you have a teacher or a tutor, but a friend or a coworker might also work if they are willing to help you, and they don't even need to know anything about the language other than the language. Let's say I'm learning German, for example, and I learned that the verb always goes in the second position. So, for example, in sentences like Wohin geht er? Er geht nach Hause. The verb is in the second position. But then I come across this sentence, geht er nach Hause, where the verb is not in the second position. And this is a really great opportunity to form a hypothesis. The hypothesis, for example, could be, does a question make the verb go in the first position? Well, we already had a question, wohin geht er? Where the verb is not in the first position, so we gotta redefine our hypothesis. Maybe the hypothesis then could be, does a question where there is no question word in it, does that make the verb go in the first position? So this is now where we approach our little native helper, and instead of asking the hypothesis to them directly, because chances are a lot of natives don't actually know the rules of their language unless they are really basic, and they're also really good at making up rules. So don't ask them the hypothesis, ask them clarifying questions. My personal favorite is asking them, is the sentence correct? And then giving them sentences that kind of test your hypothesis. So in our case, we could say, is the sentence correct? Hast du einen Hund? Isst du gerne Müsli? And while you do this, try out some different sentence patterns, try out some different verbs to find out whether the hypothesis that you initially made is right or wrong. And you can then redefine your hypothesis and maybe find some rules or find some exceptions according to the answers. Your friends might be a little confused about why you're asking them so many random questions, but just tell them that that is how you learn best and to please answer your questions. Once you have your answers to your clarifying questions, take a mental note or a physical note and keep redefining your hypothesis until you think you figured out the rule. It takes some practice in the beginning to get into this mindset of being actively involved in the language learning process, but I think it is so beneficial and honestly just more fun. I hope that this video and my explanations were helpful. Again, if you want to see this process in action, check out Israel's video. I will also link it down in the description below. And that is it for today. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next video.